Nepal witnessed unseasonal incessant rainfall for days in October this year. That induced floods and landslides across the nation, claiming the lives of over 100 people, damaging properties and ready-to-harvest crops worth billions of rupees. These incidents were a result of climate change, or what we now have begun calling climate crisis. Many countries across the world have reported of similar catastrophic incidents around the year, and scientists and activists say the frequency of these incidents that we are not equipped to deal with is only going to rise in the years to come if we do not put actions together to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, leaders and delegates from over 200 countries gathered in Glasgow, Scotland this month to come together and discuss on possible ways and efforts that can be put together in order to control or limit our carbon emission. They attended the COP26 summit, where many big countries, big polluters, fell short in their commitments, while many others gave mega promises as well. Nepal, one of the participating nations, had a list of commitments put forth as well. Today, we're going to be talking about the achievements of COP26 and the challenges that lie as we move ahead. Joining me now on Kantipur News is the British Ambassador to Nepal, Her Excellency Nicola Politt. Your Excellency, welcome to Kantipur News.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Let me begin by congratulating the British government for the successful completion of COP26.
Thank you very much. We're pleased with what's been achieved.
Can we really call it a success, given the widespread criticism in many countries, even in Glasgow, from climate activists for what they call a hypocrisy of the event itself?
Well, I think a huge amount has been achieved, and we saw 130 world leaders come together at the beginning of the summit to announce ambitious net zero targets, and we were really pleased to see Prime Minister Diop leading the Nepal delegation and announcing some ambitious commitments on Nepal's part. And in addition to that, lots of new commitments in specific areas. So, for example, around the phasing out of coal, around the use of electric vehicles, around risk and early action to try to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. And importantly, on financing as well, some really big new commitments from developed countries. There's always more that is needed, but I think some really significant commitments that we should be pleased about.
Let's dive into the commitments that Nepal has made at COP26. The first one is to remain cumulatively net zero carbon between 2022 to 2045. What does this mean?
So yes, let me explain what cumulative means, because most countries have simply made a net zero commitment, and that was Nepal's commitment, was to be net zero by 2045. But earlier this week they announced a more ambitious commitment, which was this cumulative net zero commitment. And what that means is that on average, over the period 2022 to 2045, Nepal's carbon emissions will be net zero. So they will absorb more carbon than they produce. And the reason that Nepal is talking in that cumulative or average language is because right now Nepal is net zero, and with some more investment in forestry can remain net zero up to 2033. But after that, as Nepal's economy develops, developing country produces more carbon emissions, and in parallel with that, the trees, as they mature, stop absorbing so much carbon. So there is a short period after 2033 where Nepal will actually emit more carbon than it absorbs. But over the period to 2045, on average, those emissions will be net zero. And that's a really important commitment and signal of leadership from a country like Nepal.
This connects with the second commitment. The second commitment is to increase the forest cover from the 37.4%, the current percentage, to 45%. Can we be hopeful on it?
I think so. I mean, Nepal's forest cover and its forest policies, its community forestry is world renowned and actually world leading. And we were pleased to see Prime Minister Diop amongst a small group of other leaders at COP26 headlining a panel event on forests and land use. And that is a signal of just how well Nepal does this. So it's quite a small increase in forest cover that Nepal needs to make, and it's also just committed to halt deforestation, which is also important, and some work needs to be done in that area too. But we have seen other countries looking at what Nepal does on, for example, community forestry as a model. So I think some real positives there that Nepal can build on.
The third commitment is to ensure that all the vulnerable population are protected from the impacts of climate change by 2030. What does this include? Are we capable? What do we need?
Yes, I think this is one of the most ambitious commitments because we know that Nepal is highly climate vulnerable and that there are a lot of communities who are vulnerable. But I think it is possible with the right investment and the right commitment. And Nepal has already started to do this. So for some time, the government has been working on local action plans known as LAPAs. And each Gaupalika has or will have one of those plans. And it's important that these plans to help the vulnerable communities are developed by those communities, in those communities, for those communities. And so the UK, for example, is helping through our climate programmes to support local governments to decide what is it that we need to protect our community from climate shocks. And it might be that you need more climate resilient infrastructure, bridges and roads, or it might be that you need to move houses around or protect houses from flooding, those kind of things. But the local communities need to decide what those are, and then those plans need to be fully funded.
Are there any key observations that you have made as our country, as our two governments actually work to tackle the impacts of climate change?
Climate change is one of the priority areas of our support here. Since 2015, we've committed $500 million to supporting climate change programs in Nepal. And we have some further programs in development.
The government has also said the commitments were conditional, that we have an access to climate finance. How can we raise our access?
So the UK has committed $12.6 billion of financing to climate change internationally over the period 2020 to 2025. And a good proportion of that will come to Nepal. It's difficult to say exactly how much that will be because it's made up of not just the money that we spend through the embassy here as part of our programs, but also money that we put into the big international climate funds like the Green Climate Fund, which Nepal has access to through its government. So there is international financing out there, and Nepal and the delegation at COP were able to meet some of the people who run those funds as well to try to help support their access to those funds. And here in the region, we've also just announced a new climate change program for South Asia, £274 million across the region, specifically focused on resilience. So Nepal will benefit from that and particularly support areas which are of importance to Nepal.
Now let's get into the gender perspective of climate change. There is no doubt that women are at a disproportional impact receiving end of climate change. How has COP26 addressed the issues of women?
Yeah, this is a really important angle and one which I've been talking a lot about in the run-up to COP26. So I had the privilege of meeting young women who were affected by climate change and some of whom have been studying the impacts. I've also been talking to the Ministry of Forest and Environment who have done quite a lot of work in this area and have quite a good gender strategy that sits alongside Nepal's long-term strategy, so that when Nepal implements some of its commitments, there is already in place a plan for how the gender aspects and the support to women in the communities will be made. At COP itself, this week has been a Gender Day, so an important chance to focus on some of these issues, make sure that leaders and delegations and negotiating teams are really thinking about this as part of the work that they do. And the overall COP agreement, which will be signed by all of the countries, will have a gender element to it which highlights some of these issues. I think the other thing I would say on this is that in Nepal the effects are perhaps different on gender than they would be in the UK, for example. So each country needs to look very closely at the impact of climate change on women and think, as I've said earlier, at a local level about how to respond to that.
So because of the differential impact of climate change, Nepal's mountainous region especially is very vulnerable to climate change. The government of Nepal also raised the issue of mountain agenda at COP26. How effective do you think it was, and will it be able to produce any significant result?
So I was really pleased to see Prime Minister Dobe mention the vulnerability in the mountains and the importance of thinking about mountains and mountain communities in his speech at COP26. And I think it's also really good news that he has said that Nepal will host the Sagarmatha dialogue next year, because I think that's another way of emphasising and promoting the vulnerability and the importance of the mountains in this climate debate.
Nepal has definitely fallen short with its commitments made in 2015. Do we have adequate base to believe that we'll attain the commitments this time around?
So I think we should look forward. And we should look at the important commitments that this government has made in 2021. And as I've said, it's now about implementation, and we need strong plans. We need really clear action plans and a division of responsibility under those. Nepal's development partners have come together a few months ago and put $4.2 billion behind a green, resilient and inclusive development framework, and that is the framework which we will use to support Nepal to implement the plans that it has. So a huge amount to do, of course, but lots of support and lots of ambition to do it.
Your Excellency, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.